Our next speaker, John Tresch, is the Mellon Professor in Art History, History of Science and Folk Practice at the Warburg Institute, School of Advanced Study at the University of London. He received his BA in Anthropology from the University of Chicago, his PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge University. He also holds a Diplôme d'études approfondies from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and is a former student of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Dr. Tresch's polymathic, indeed, one should say indeed Warburgian research focuses on changing methods, instruments, and institutions in the sciences, arts, and media, connections among disciplines, cosmology, social order, and ritual, and shifting definitions of the rational and the real. His most recent publications include The Romantic Machine, Utopian Science and Technology After Napoleon, appearing in 2012, and winner of the 2013 Pfizer Award for Outstanding Book in History of Science. And now, the 2020, The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science, about which he will speak today. So over to you, John Tresch.
Thanks very much, Professor Tropper, and to everyone at the APS for the invitation and for organizing this. It's a real honor to be here in such august company, but of course, it's a tough act to follow coming after Professor Beard. I'm really happy to be here even virtually at the APS and in Philadelphia, because both are part of what I want to talk about today, which is a bit taken from my book, The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, which came out this summer. And this is a new biography of Edgar Allan Poe. And unlike other biographies, this one focuses on his lifelong engagement with the sciences. In a way, it's also a biographical sketch of American science in its youth. And both of those stories, both of those biographies, Poe's and American Sciences, are really centered in Philadelphia. It's the city in which Poe lived for the longest as an adult, and where he wrote his most famous tales. And in the 1830s and 40s, while Poe was living there, Philadelphia was really the beating heart of American science. So I'm going to switch on my magic lantern. And dear me, sorry. Just adjusting my controls. So you probably know Poe already from his scary stories, such as The Pit and the Pendulum, The Cask of Amontillado, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Black Cat, and you've certainly read or heard The Raven, either in junior high or an American literature course, or with Bart Simpson in The Treehouse of Horror. Poe's tales of madness, obsession, and murder are deeply woven into American and indeed world culture. They're the source of bad dreams, and these days, the source of endless memes. And my book tells the full story of his tragic life, but from a new angle. It focuses on his lifelong engagement with science. His brief life coincided with massive changes in the nature and the place of science. It's a period that philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called the Second Scientific Revolution. There was a new push to mathematize nature, along with a rise in specialized disciplines. There was also a flood of new publications and popular presentations of chemistry, electromagnetism, biology, and astronomy in lyceums and lecture halls. Leading scientists, many of them based in Philadelphia, also were striving to create new institutions for a national, federally funded framework for American science. The idea was to allow American scientists to speak with a single voice and to speak with authority, to shut down frauds and forgers, and to compete on equal terms with research being done in Europe. Poe's own writings are mind-bogglingly diverse. He published in a huge range of magazines and newspapers, but one recurrent theme is his fascination with science. He lectured on the rational principles of literature in the very same halls where natural historians, geologists, phrenologists, and mesmerists explained their work and published in the same pages. He wrote in support of new national initiatives, such as the South Seas Exploring Expedition, and supported plans to use the crates of gold that had been left to the US government by Robert Smithson for a national research university. And in 1846, this became the Smithsonian Institution. Even his speculative and horror fiction was shaped by new developments in the sciences. At times, he straightforwardly dramatized science's perspectives, as in the tale A Descent into the Maelstrom. In that story, a Norwegian sailor's ship is caught in a whirlpool. He uses Baconian observation and inductive reasoning to find a way to ride out the storm. But at other times, Poe cast a very critical eye on science's blind spots. He worried about the new obsession for rule-based methods, what today we might call algorithms. He feared that objectivity and the detachment it brought with it might bring a technical exploitation of nature and of humans that could destroy both. One of his early works was an attack on a 19th century version of artificial intelligence. He wrote about a chess-playing machine that toured the States, the automaton chess player of Mellon. In a blistering argument, Poe demonstrated that this mechanical human could not play chess by clockwork alone. There had to be a human hiding inside it, moving the pieces. No machine, at least in the 1830s, could replace the complexities of human thought. But Poe also published convincing scientific hoaxes of his own. One was about a balloon crossing the Atlantic. Others were about the strange new science of mesmerism, a form of hypnosis which explored the limits of consciousness. These hoaxes were imaginative feats, but they also suggested how gullible people had become toward claims of new discoveries and technical progress. And in a bizarre but fascinating work that he wrote towards the end of his life, Eureka, A History of the Material and Spiritual Universe, Poe challenged his contemporary scientists for their restricted, lifeless view of the cosmos. His engagement with science was immensely strengthened during his time in Philadelphia. He lived there from 1838 to 1844. He'd been born in 1809 in Boston, the son of actors who died by the time he was 2. He was raised in Richmond by his foster father, John Allan, who disowned him at the age of 18. He joined the army and served as an artificer, repairing his battalion's equipment before he started officers training at West Point Military Academy. There he received lessons at the cutting edge of engineering, mathematics, astronomy, and physics. After leaving West Point, he set out as an author in Baltimore, and his poems and stories eventually led him to a position as an editor back in Richmond. But in 1837, he was fired for drinking too many mint juleps, he said. He spent a few months in New York, just as a nationwide financial depression was setting in. So what brought Poe to Philadelphia at the age of 29 was a job offer, an opportunity to write a scientific textbook. The natural historian Thomas Wyatt needed a shorter, cheaper version of his own textbook on conchology, the classification of shells, to sell at his lectures. And he hired Poe to do this. Poe talked with the geologist Isaac Lee and consulted French textbooks at the library company on Locust in a reading room overlooked by a giant bust of Athena, which might have given him an idea for the staging of the Raven. The result was the conchologist's first book. This was a portable, inexpensive seashell collecting guide, which would actually be the best-selling book that Poe published during his lifetime. While Poe lived in Philadelphia, it was known as the Athens of America. It had the country's most active culture of research, experiment, and invention. Besides the august American Philosophical Society, founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin, which is hosting this event, Philadelphia was also home to the Academy of Natural Sciences and the Franklin Institute, which just opened its doors in 1824. The physicist John Henry, who was the future director of the Smithsonian, was part of a club of researchers at the Franklin who studied electromagnetism, steam engines, and storms. In public scientific performances of this time, there was a strong emphasis on entertainment just as much as on instruction. Early performances of animal magnetism and dazzling displays of magic lanterns enthralled audiences. Many lecturers courted controversy. The anatomist Samuel Morton in Philadelphia was famous and now notorious for his collection of skulls, many stolen from graves or taken from enslaved Africans or captive Native Americans. Morton used measurements of these skulls to argue against the biblical account of creation for a hierarchy among human races and of multiple creations, or polygenesis. Morton helped bring George Combe, the Scottish phrenologist, to Philadelphia to inform crowds about how to read personality off the bumps on people's heads. But at the center of Philadelphia's scientific activity was Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, the West Point graduate, Alexander Dallas Bache. From the University of Pennsylvania and the Franklin Institute, he went on to lead the US Coast Survey, turning it into a national program for scientific training and for mapping newly seized Western territories. In his hometown, Bache encouraged research in steam, electricity, and optics, including writing the first American appreciation of photography, the Daguerreotype. The Daguerreotype caught Poes' eye too, while he was in Philadelphia at the same moment. It's been argued that this image, found in the archives of the Academy of Natural Sciences, shows Poe in that building in 1840, alongside Morton in the top hat. It's definitely Morton, but it's probably not Poe. Nevertheless, Poe was definitely immersed in Philadelphia's distinctive culture of scientists, inventors, and artists. He even followed up on Bache's announcement about the Daguerreotype and wrote some of the first American appreciations of the new technique. Here he wrote, "In truth, the daguerreotyped plate is infinitely, and we use the term advisedly, is infinitely more accurate in its representation than any painting by human hands. If we examine a work of ordinary art by means of a powerful telescope, all traces of resemblance to nature will disappear, but the closest scrutiny of the photogenic drawing discloses only a more absolute truth, a more perfect identity of aspect with the thing represented." For Poe, the daguerreotype becomes a kind of magical portal, unveiling an endless succession of views into hidden layers of reality, each more subtle than the last. And this would become a typical move for Poe. He drew out hidden possibilities within the sciences, approaching them from new angles, pushing them to their limits, revealing their fantastic dimensions. In Philadelphia, he cultivated the persona of the expert reasoner. In a series on cryptography, he challenged his readers to submit encoded texts, which he then deciphered. His chapters on science and art explained new inventions and theories, making him one of America's first science reporters. And with his tales that featured C. Auguste Dupin, who was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, Poe invented the modern detective story and fixed the image of the eccentric, ingenious reasoner who's able to outsmart both criminals and cops. By the start of 1842, Poe was riding high. He was the lead critic for Graham's Magazine, a Philadelphia publication with a subscription list of over 30,000. Poe said it was the largest in the world. His stories had been collected. He hobnobbed with Charles Dickens during Dickens's US tour, and with his aunt and young wife, Virginia, who was also famously his cousin. He was living in relative comfort on 17th and Spruce in Philadelphia, and he could even afford some indulgences, like this French pocket watch, which was engraved with his name. And this watch still exists. It was actually auctioned recently for $250, which is money I'm sure Poe would have been happy to have had at the time that he purchased it. But in February of 1842, things took a tragic turn. While she was singing, Virginia burst a blood vessel and began to cough up blood. This was a sure sign of consumption or tuberculosis, for which there was no cure. Poe abruptly quit his job at Graham's and began a spell of terrifying drinking binges. In this very grim period, he also crafted the stories that would make his legend: sharp, shocking tales of guilt and horror, including The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, and his masterpiece of morbid suspense, The Telltale Heart. Though The Telltale Heart used language and imagery from the sciences, Poe gave his readers an experience not of certainty and reassurance, but of disorientation and horror. Opening in the middle of a conversation, perhaps an asylum visit or a trial. The narrator boasts of the sharpness of his senses. The tale famously begins, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story." The speaker has become fixated on the opaque eye of the old man who shares his house. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell on me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. He proceeds with cool, objective detachment toward an irrational goal. With patience and precision, he stalks the man, peering into his room at midnight with a lantern open just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. On the seventh night, the old man awakens, sensing the intruder. After an agonizing silence, he stealthily opens his lantern until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and full upon the vulture eye. At once he hears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. It's the beating of the terrified old man's heart, so loudly the narrator fears that neighbors will hear. In its detail and regularity, his description mimics the report of a meticulously designed scientific experiment. Light, usually a symbol of knowledge and reason, is here associated with madness. The darkened room recalls the camera obscura, the technical core of the daguerreotype, and the enclosed space into which images of the outside world are projected. Yet the light that pierces this room is artificial. What's projected is the thread of a spider ensnaring its prey. The tale also restages one of the primal scenes of modern science, Isaac Newton's prism experiments in the optics. There, Newton detailed the steps through which he cracked open a shutter to let a single ray of light into a darkened room and dismembered it with a prism, revealing the colors of the spectrum. Poe's tale inverts Newton's experiment, making vision and methodical reason the agents of perversity and death. He flips the heightened sensitivity of the new precision instruments of his time into a pathology, allowing his narrator to perceive many things in hell. The narrator murders the old man. Methodical as ever, he dismembers the body and buries its parts beneath the floorboards. The police arrive. He coolly entertains them, offering refreshments, placing their chairs on the guilty floorboards. He then begins to hear once again a constant beating, like a watch wrapped in cotton, his dead victim's heart growing louder and louder. The merciless pounding and the chatter of the police drive him to a frenzy, until at last he cries out in agony and confesses his crime. Just as his desire to demonstrate his reasonable calm led to the uncovering of the murder, his heightened senses gave him access to sounds that took him beyond the limits of normal experience. By detailing an act of violent irrationality in the language of scientific method, Poe dramatized the dark side of the Enlightenment, a vision which was uncannily familiar to Americans that were enmeshed in an allegedly rational economic and political order defined by ruthless competition, slavery, and violent settlement. Though it was usually presented to them in tones of equality, freedom, and progress, beneath the appearance of calm reason also pulsed veins of terror, obsession, and cruelty. Poe gave the screw another turn. While the heart beneath the floorboards might symbolize the narrator's criminal madness, the monstrous guilt that his reason and patter cannot mask, it also echoes the ultimate symbol of method and rationality, a mechanical watch, the embodiment of the clockwork universe and the icon of natural theology and the argument from design. The tale peels back a rational surface to reveal inexplicable forces. When another layer is lifted, these forces are revealed as instruments of a deeper mechanism with a reason all its own. It also made for a damn good read. The tale has terrified school children and delighted adults since its publication. After Virginia's crisis, things went worse and worse for Poe in Philadelphia. He declared bankruptcy and headed to New York, where he scrambled to survive. Despite hardship, he was able to reach his first national success with The Raven. He explored the distant reaches of the mind with mesmerists and with the founders of spiritualism. And in 1848, he wrote Eureka, his scientific and poetic cosmology. This work was later admired by Einstein. It might have been an influence on the authors of the modern Big Bang Theory, and it explained why the night sky is dark. But those are stories for another night. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much. I'm looking for the questions. While I'm waiting, I just want to say, I thought we were right back on track, and just want to say all the problems we've had are here in Washington, DC, and not with our wonderful APS technical staff who are obviously ready for every eventuality. So
I see some questions.
Elizabeth,
Yeah.
they're in the Q&A for you. They're
I
directly
have a
Q&A for you.
from Howard Gardner, who says, thanks for this mind-expanding talk. If he could return to Earth today, which aspects of the sciences would surprise Poe the most? Which would meet his anticipations?
Great question. I think he would be least surprised by air travel and space travel. He wrote stories about crossing the Atlantic and also traveling to the moon. So as his reader, Jules Verne, picked up on, Poe recognized the possibilities in the aeronautics of the time, making it possible to travel beyond the stratosphere. So that wouldn't have shocked him. But I think, in fact, artificial intelligence might have shocked him. As I mentioned in that story, that essay on Melzer's chess player, he thought that machines of his time were limited in such a way that there was no way that they could imitate thought. They could repeat, they could do basic mathematics, but the unpredictability of the chess game was something that machines couldn't do. So I think he would be rather stunned and staggered, but fascinated by the ways in which machines have come to imitate some aspects of human intelligence. And a lot of his work is kind of working with that uncanny sense of recognizing, of encountering a machine that seems to be able to think. And in fact, as his writing went on, that thought became more prominent in his work.
Thank you. Another question, I'm sure you can answer this, from Cyril Magen, and who asks, who did your wonderful illustrations? Edward Gorey?
It would be great if I could have hired Edward Gorey to illustrate the talk entirely. Gorey did do some illustrations of Poe works, and one of them, the one of the heart beneath the floorboards, that's Edward Gorey. But others are taken from here and there, including the many remarkable illustrators, starting from the end of the 19th century, who were inspired by Poe's writings. Aubrey Beardsley, Thomas Clark, among others, drew images on the basis of his tales. But the memes are all recent productions. People love to take pictures of Poe and cut and paste and add funny captions to them.
Wonderful, thank you. Any further questions? I just wonder, while we just see if there are any more questions, if you might say a little bit about Poe and the emotions. And I mean, the heart for us is a kind of emblem of emotions, and yet he seems so interested in what mechanisms can do. And does he have anything to say about theories of the emotion?
Quite a bit. And that's part of his critique of science. As I said, on the one hand, he's very much engaged with the science of his time and has these kind of blistering displays of rationality where he argues against or criticizes contemporary authors or contemporary scientists as well. So reason, rationality is very much part of his psychology, but he's constantly showing the way in which trying to overcome reason by rationality alone is doomed. And in a way, that's what the Telltale Heart is demonstrating, that this narrator who, with complete methodical rationality, plots out this murder, which is, of course, irrational, is obviously driven by something that he's not able to recognize, that he's not able to name, by some kind of emotional passion that overwhelms him to make him act out in such a way. And in other of his stories, in his poems, they're really drenched in emotion, in sadness. He had an extremely tragic life. Many people that he loved died during his lifetime. And I really see, I think your question's really spot on. What he's doing is dramatizing the interplay between the emotions and the reason, and seeing the way in which they can be at odds, how they can be at odds within a single mind, and the consequences of that kind of internal war. And ultimately, I think the emotions often have the upper hand, often overcome the reason. But the drama of trying to suppress the emotions is one that over and over plays out in his tales, which is why he was so inspiring for psychoanalysis, for people like Freud and Lacan.
Thank you so much. This is just a question from Sarah Seeger, who says, random question. Do you know why he used the pseudonym The Bostonian for his poetry book, Tamerlane?
Yes, not random at all. He published it while in Boston, so he was hoping for it to be well received there, and it sank like a stone. And that's when he went and joined the army. He published it when he was 19, age 19 or 20. So he was aiming for an audience in Boston. But the reason he calls himself a Bostonian is that he was born in Boston to traveling actors. So they left Boston very quickly. His mother died in Richmond, but she told him to return to Boston if he was ever in trouble, and he would be warmly received. And to his great chagrin, that wasn't the case. So much later in his life, he had a whole vendetta against Boston, against the Transcendentalists, above all against Longfellow, the kind of leading poet of the era, whom he accused of plagiarism and a lack of inspiration. So his relation to Boston is extremely conflicted, just as his relation to all the emotions. Not that Boston's an emotion, but.
And question from Bob Hauser. Have Poe's scientific interests and contributions been recognized by others since his death? Why have those aspects of his life had little attention? Is it just the prominence of his fiction and poetry?
The fiction and poetry is extraordinary, and poets have received his work, especially thanks to the translations of Charles Baudelaire, with great enthusiasm over the 19th and into the 20th century. And many important literary critics, the new critics, focused on Poe's theories of poetry as part of his greatness and legend. So really the poetry and the fiction, which is so dramatic, has overshadowed a lot of the other writing. And that fiction, as I've shown, is very much about the emotions having the upper hand, about the imagination as well. So it seems that the kind of interest in observation and rationality that's so fundamental to his scientific work really got overshadowed by the fiction and poetry. That said, Jules Verne was completely inspired by Poe, and his entire scientific oeuvre is based in really with direct sources, direct influence on what Poe did. Among the scientists who recognized Poe, they're around the turn of the 20th century, the poet Paul Valéry, who was in contact with a lot of physicists in Paris, wrote a book appreciating Eureka, the cosmology that Poe wrote at the end of his life, comparing it to the work of Einstein. And perhaps as a result of that, there's a pretty good case to be made that Alexander Friedmann and Georges Lemaitre, who were the physicists who, after Einstein, came up with a theory of the origins of the universe that was in conformity with relativistic physics, but where everything started from a single particle and rapidly exploded outward. The Big Bang Theory. These are the inventors of the Big Bang Theory. That theory is very closely resembles Eureka, and it's entirely possible that they were inspired by Poe. Friedman acknowledged Poe and Dostoevsky as his favorite authors, and Lemaitre was in a literary milieu in Belgium where Valerie's work was really massively esteemed. So there has been some recognition of this aspect of Poe's work, but what I'm trying to do is put this together as a kind of red thread running through his entire life, and truly it's there. It's with him from the beginning.
Thank you for that. Linda Kerber comes up with a question that actually occurred to me too, and she says, a fascinating talk. Working in the other direction, is it possible that Toni Morrison thought at all of Poe when writing The Bluest Eye?
It's extremely likely. Toni Morrison wrote a very important book in American literature, Romancing the Shadow, which is about the figure of Blackness in American literature, and the way in which so much of celebrated American literature imagines an excluded African presence as a kind of driving force in what's written. And Poe was raised in the South as an inheritor of, he was raised to be an inheritor of the Southern aristocracy. He was, African slaves were part of his upbringing. And she shows in that book that, especially the book, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, the image of Africanness pitched onto the color black is really a structural feature of Poe's imagination, as it was for many authors, but she really focuses on Poe as laying that out in extremely stark terms, and really introduces a very important genre of and awareness and insights into American criticism of American literature. So the Bluest Eye, which you heard in that tale from, or the pale blue eye of the victim of the narrator of the Telltale Heart, I think undoubtedly is an echo of Poe's work, which she knew extremely well.
Do you talk about it in the book?
I do. I do.
Yes.
And there's an ongoing debate in Poe studies about how to read Poe and his views on race. There was a moment, a fairly long moment in the early 20th century, where Poe was celebrated as a Southern author, and therefore a kind of defender of slavery and of the Confederacy after the Civil War. And there are certainly elements in his writing that have quite grotesque racial stereotypes in them. And he's like most authors, arguably all authors, white authors in the U.S. in the 19th century, there's a racist cast to his writing. That said, recent scholarship has pointed out that, again, that's quite a general feature of American writing in the 19th century, that even the most convinced abolitionists carried with them several racist stereotypes. So in that sense, Poe's not extraordinary, he's not exceptional. And what they've pointed out, and I follow along with this, is that Poe's identifications traveled as he did. So though he was raised in Richmond, he identified as a Bostonian when he was in Boston. He was born in Boston. And later, when he came back to Boston, he spoke of himself as a Northerner. While in Philadelphia, he wrote as a Philadelphian. In New York, he wrote as a New Yorker. So his positioning, especially on this crucial question of North versus South, abolition versus slavery, which is just taking shape in his lifetime, he was relatively quiet about it. He never made any outright statement for or against slavery, in part because he was aiming for a national audience. He didn't want to alienate readers on either side. So pinning down a specific view of his on this issue is kind of a futile quest, because his views were changing so constantly as he moved and as he had tried to reach many different audiences. But yes, I do talk about it in the book, and it's a very troubling aspect of Poe's life, and also a very complicated issue for making sense of 19th century American literature at all. Even writing about figures like Emerson or Longfellow, who have very strong abolitionist views, there are statements and views which are quite shocking to 21st century sensibilities. And that's true of Poe as well.
Well, I think, Annie, maybe we're at the moment to move to our third speaker. Is that correct?
That was terrific. Thank you. And yes, it is time to move to our third speaker. So thank you very much.